What's up, everybody? Thanks as always for supporting the show. It would mean a lot to me if you would take a second to scroll down and hit that subscribe button to the Hoops Tonight YouTube channel, and then follow me on social media on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter so you guys don't miss any of our content over the course of this season. All right, let's talk some basketball. Why did the Bucks fire Adrian Griffin and hire Doc Rivers? So first of all, there's two ways of looking at this. There's like the kind of like retrospective, like let's look back and kind of try to see what the ultimate kind of like goal here was. And that gets confusing as you zoom out and you're like, okay, so you fire Mike Budenholzer because you don't think he's good enough with playoff adjustments. So you hire a rookie head coach. And then when that goes south, you then go hire Doc Rivers, another guy whose kind of reputation is being a guy who struggles with playoff adjustments and famously has blown a lot of series late after taking early series leads. So yeah, as you zoom out, like it doesn't make a ton of sense. There's no doubt. However, if you zoom in just a little bit, like cut the Mike Budenholzer and hiring Adrian Griffin piece out, and you just zoom in on this season, it makes sense to me. Do I think it's going to fix all of Milwaukee's problems? No, but it does make sense to me. And I want to kind of break this down so you guys can kind of understand where I'm coming from. First of all, Adrian Griffin was not the right coach for this particular team. Forget about the decision to hire him. Just acknowledge the reality that he was the head coach for this season, okay? It's been a pretty consistent thing. One of the things that I do in my job is I constantly am picking the brains of other people around the league. Like I'm a big believer in like, I don't know everything about basketball. I just have my personal perspective, and the best way to kind of round out that perspective is to include as many perspectives as possible. And so I talk to a lot of people around the league, people who cover the league nationally, people who cover individual teams, agents, so on and so forth, right? So when I talk to those guys, there have been some consistent things that I've gotten back. And one of the big ones is Adrian Griffin is not doing a very good job with the Bucks this year. Obviously, I had my own kind of suspicions there, right? As I'm watching the team, I'm like, okay, Adrian Griffin, coach for the Raptors. The Raptors under Nick Nurse ran this like super aggressive like pick and roll blitz and recover scheme. And Adrian Griffin's bringing that to the Bucks. And the Bucks have Brook Lopez, this like kind of slow-footed big guy who's like really good when he's around the basket, but when he gets out to the perimeter can have some issues. Like overall, their team speed isn't great, so they're not great in rotation. Outside of like Giannis, they're pretty unathletic at most positions. So I'm like, this doesn't make a lot of sense, right? And then there were a lot of like clear indicators that the team wasn't playing hard consistently, right? Like 20th in defensive rating, they don't guard. They're dead last in opponent transition frequency. They don't run back. There's bad body language. There's blowout losses. All these like clear indicators that things weren't working, right? And then you got to add the urgency element to it. Dame is older and appears to be on the decline, right? Like, I'm not saying that he is declined, but like, this is the first season where you're starting to see like, oh, like smaller guard, a little bit undersized, shots not falling, the defense is worse than it's ever been. Like, there's some concerns there, right? And then also, if things go south, Giannis requesting a trade is a high likelihood, right? Like, this whole team is old. They don't have a ton to offer Giannis on the basketball side of things other than Dame, and Dame is older. So, like, you can imagine a scenario where, like, Dame has some struggles this year. Things don't go well. Brook gets older. Chris Middleton gets older. There's a version of this where Giannis looks around and goes like, "What? I don't want to be here anymore," right? So there's some urgency there. And then also these young teams are coming. Like you look around the league and it's a lot of these, like, it's like, okay, Orlando looks like they could be really good in the long run. Oklahoma City looks like they could be really good in the long run. The New Orleans Pelicans look like they can be really good in the long run, right? Like Minnesota Timberwolves, there's all these teams out there that look like they're on the rise. And so it kind of feels like this is a very important season for the Milwaukee Bucks, right? And so I don't think interim head coach was an option for them. They knew Adrian Griffin wasn't the right guy. That's a consensus. That's not just me. That's within that locker room. Giannis himself was going up to the press conferences and he was literally saying, like, he was complaining about the defensive schemes. So obviously there was issues with the general manager, or I should say the front office and the ownership group as it pertains to Adrian Griffin. Obviously the players had some issue with him. Terry Stotts had issues with him. And then around the league, it's a consensus that he was struggling, right? So like, that's the reality. Then you combine that with the urgency, And you got to find somebody to get in there who's the best possible option to get in there and just kind of get the most out of this group for this season, right? They didn't want to go to an interim head coach. They sensed the urgency. They go for Doc Rivers. Now, is Doc Rivers going to help with the tactical side of things? That's not what he's known for. To me, Doc Rivers' best trait that he brings to a basketball team is personality, management, and motivation. Get him into a room with a bunch of guys with egos. He's got enough of an aura surrounding him that he commands respect. He's going to be able to get some of that buy-in that they weren't getting. And if he can just clean up things on the margins, that will go a long way towards helping their situation. We're going to talk more about the basketball side of it here in just a second. I'm just focusing on the big picture here, right? So as we zoom out and you go from Budenholzer to Griffin to Doc, you're like, what the hell are they doing, right? But you zoom in and you go, Adrian Griffin's not the right coach. There's real urgency. We need someone to come in in January to turn this thing around. Doc's available. He'll at least be able to get them to buy in. I get it. Obviously, he's not the perfect coach in a vacuum for this team, but under the circumstances, I think we can state unequivocally that the Bucks have a better chance to get it done this season with Doc than they do with Adrian Griffin. And therefore, if we zoom in, it was a good move. Obviously, we zoom out, it's confusing. Zoom in, it's a good move. Question number 2. What can Doc help the Bucks with to help them reach their potential? I wrote down a few things for us. 3 things in specific. Number 1, get defensive buy-in from Dame. He's been the primary culprit in their defensive struggles all season long. He doesn't need to be amazing on that end, but he needs to do his job. And right now, he's not even doing his job. To put it simply, they can't win the title this year unless they get like a Steph Curry-esque just commitment to doing the job from Damian Lillard. And that's something I think Doc can help with from the standpoint of being a big enough personality to look Dame in the face and be like, this is non-negotiable. This is what we need from you. And when I say Steph, what I mean, Steph was never a deeply impactful athlete. He's not a guy that is going to go toe-to-toe with the best perimeter initiators in the league and hold his own. As a matter of fact, Dame is actually a little bit quicker, right? Dame is actually, even though he's undersized, is a little bit better athlete. But Steph does his job. He understands his role in the defensive scheme. You can see him working his butt off. You can see him chasing over the top. You can see him putting himself in help and recover situations. You can see him at least trying to keep the person in front and force him to take a tough jump shot. You can see Steph trying, right? And that's gone from making him to what early in his career was a bad defensive player to being an average defensive player. And if you have an average defensive player in an excellent defensive scheme, you can get stops. That's step 1. You got to get defensive buy-in from Dame. Step 2, help Dame and Giannis maximize their success in pick and roll. The Bucks are just 9th in offense in January. They've been a really good offense most of the season, but I still think they have some significant room for improvement. By the way, this has been something I've said all season. What have I said consistently about the Bucks? They can be so much better than they have been, right? Specifically, I think if we can acknowledge the reality that they're not going to be an elite defense, right? They're not going to be elite. They can get to okay, but they're not going to be elite. And so if you're not going to be an elite defense, you've got to be like Denver on offense, meaning in a half-court slowdown environment, you have to consistently get absolutely great shots every single time, which this group is capable of doing. In the Dame pick and roll stuff with Giannis, I think there's a lot of meat on the bone there still. Giannis is missing reads on the roll, which we'll talk about in a minute. They're getting in each other's way a lot of the time. Obviously, this is normal. This is to be expected. 2 stars kind of learning how to play together. And then Dame in general is struggling to find his offensive rhythm. They can run more pick and roll. These are some fixes. Dame's pick and roll frequency is down this year from last year. I think that's having an effect on his rhythm. You need all the reps you can get, not just for Dame's rhythm, but for the continuity and chemistry between those two. And then obviously I've been talking about this all year. I think they need to simplify the reads. A lot of the high pick and roll in the middle of the floor stuff leads to Giannis catching on short rolls around the foul line. When he catches short rolls around the foul line, he has to see a ton of the floor on both sides of him. And that can get a little tricky for Giannis sometimes. I love middle of the floor operation for top tier passers, because it is actually the hardest spot on the floor for the defense to guard, because there's a lot more openings. right? Whereas with the cleared side, you can do more loading up, and then the rotations are a little bit less spread out on the weak side, right? But the problem is, if you don't have a guy that can actually see all of those reads and quickly digest them, rolling into the middle of the floor, it can be a little bit of an issue. So I like clearing the side because you keep the entire floor in front of Giannis, which makes his reads easier. I've called out several examples in my Twitter threads as I've done film sessions this year where Giannis catches in the middle of the floor and he doesn't see what's happening behind him and he misses an open shooter or like drives into traffic and struggles to make those decisions. It's just easier for Giannis when the side is clear. So from there, I would just run more action where it's like Dame Giannis pick and roll, right side of the floor, left side of the floor. Everyone else is on the opposite side of the floor. Have Dame working towards the middle with Giannis catching his rolls on the short corner on that cleared side where he's barreling down to the rim. If they zone up on that side, he has easy reads to skip because they're right in front of him. If they don't zone up, he's going ahead of steam towards the rim. So run it more. Run it with a more deliberate schematic approach to kind of create easy reads for Giannis. That's where I think things can kind of open up for them on the offensive end of the floor. You've got to find a way to get to where that action is as reliable as a Jokic-Murray pick and roll. That's got to be the goal. And then lastly, the biggest thing I think that Doc can help with is just cleaning up the details. They have to fix their transition defense. They're literally the worst in the league. They allow teams to get out in transition on more than 17% of their possessions. Dead last in the NBA. 2, they need better contests in pick and roll. The Bucks allow opponents to shoot 46% in the mid-range. That's the second worst mark in the league to the Detroit Pistons. They are the 4th worst team in the league guarding opposing pick and roll ball handlers based on points per possession. Why? Absolutely no back pressure. They have Brook running this drop coverage. He's sitting back towards the rim. He's offering late contests. That means that middle of the floor is where things are open, and specifically Dame and Malik Beasley. Malik's trying, but he just has some limitations and he loses focus. Dame's not even trying at all whatsoever, but they're not getting any of that back pressure, that chasing from behind to funnel into Brook, the late contests on floaters and pull-up jump shots, the rear view contests to try to get misses there. These are details, by the way, these are details that Doc can help with. Doc can help get them to buy into sprinting back in transition defense and communicating. Doc can help by getting their guards to be more willing to commit to the work at the point of attack. Better closeouts. Teams score 1.08 points per spot at possession against the Bucks. That's bottom 10 in the league. That's an effort thing. Closing out, containing, funneling in the right direction. Every team has a help scheme set up. You're expected to give up closeout opportunities. That's how it works. You run a ball screen, you're coming over to tag the roller, there's a skip pass to the left corner. You have a job. The majority of those teams, they want you to close out high side and funnel towards the baseline because that's where, if you can push them behind the backboard, it's an easier secondary rotation. Every team, depending on the spot on the floor, depending on the scouting report, but there's a lot of guys too where it's like, oh, this guy's a lefty, always drives left. You want to close out to the left side of him regardless of which side of the floor he's on. There's a defensive game plan when it comes to closing out to shooters on the weak side. The Bucks are bad at it. That's something that Doc can help clean up. And then lastly, paint rotations. The Bucks allow 52 points per game in the paint, which is bottom 10 in the league. With a Giannis and Brook Lopez team is just bad, right? So these are all, like, again, at the end of the day, this is on the players. But notice I'm not talking about any sort of gigantic schematic change. I don't think Doc's going to come in and flip their whole system over. But if he can just get them to buy in, which means, again, it's on the players. If they all do their jobs better, this team builds themselves more margin for error. Because Dame and Giannis are awesome, and they're going to be a devastating playoff duo. But in order to beat the best teams in the league, they can't afford to hemorrhage points in transition defense, hemorrhage points in pick and roll, hemorrhage points with bad closeouts, and hemorrhage points not making extra rotations into the paint when guys are driving. That's the thing. Are you good enough to beat Boston? Yes. Are you good enough to beat Boston when you're hemorrhaging points elsewhere? No. That's where Doc can come in and kind of clean things up. So again, in summation, obviously in a vacuum, as you kind of zoom out and you look at everything, you're like, oh, this doesn't really make a lot of sense. But Doc's a better coach for this group than Adrian Griffin. And if he can just get everybody to do their jobs, the Bucks will be better, and they will get more out of this season than they would have otherwise. That's why I look at it as a good move, even if it's not the perfect move and even if it doesn't make sense in the grand scheme of things.